So our main talk this evening is to be given by Dr. Bob Bates of the Pye Foundation. We're going to learn a lot more about Pye, but Pye is certainly a name that we knew well from some time ago, and it did, in its heyday, was a very substantial employer in the UK and elsewhere. It was eventually acquired by Philips, and under the Philips within the Philips system, I think prospered for quite a long time in the mode that we probably remember it. But it was about that time that Bob moved to work with Philips and worked in quite a few of the Philips businesses, a lot of work on microwaves, but is absolutely the best person to have that insight into what happened with Pye. And we look forward to what I'm sure is going to be a spectacular talk. Thank you.
Right, well, good evening, everybody. I usually ask how many people here worked for Pye. I don't know if anyone did. Yes, I can see at least one. And I'm sure there's several who are watching us. But Pye was the largest private employer in Cambridge at one point when it was at its peak. But what we've noticed recently is that some people have forgotten about it. And a lot of younger people don't know what Pye was. So a group of us ex-Pye employees got together and decided to create the Pye History Project to record the history of Pye. And these are the aims of the project. We set up a charitable trust to preserve the documents and the products, etc., for future generations. We also researched and documented the Pye history because a lot of it had actually got lost. Created a profile and timeline for the many Pye companies that I'll talk about. We've created a permanent exhibition about Pye at the Cambridge Museum of Technology. We've performed oral histories on a lot of ex-employees and recorded their memories, captured those, documented them. And we've created actually a couple of websites to record the history of the company. So this graph, although it says you are here in the middle, that's not where we are at the moment. That map is at the Cambridge Museum of Technology. But it shows you where some of the former Pye sites were in Cambridge. The biggest ones were St Andrews Road, Coldham's Lane, York Street, Newmarket Road, etc. But it was in a lot of places in Cambridge. In fact, there were 7,000 employees at its peak in Cambridge City alone. So if we go back through the history, this is Mr. Pye, W.G. Pye. He was born in 1869, and his father, also called William, worked at the Cambridge Instrument Company and was an instrument maker. And he trained W.G. in making scientific instruments. And this picture shows when W.G. Pye was working at the Cavendish Labs as an instrument maker. Now, he set up a part-time business. It's a classic Cambridge startup company. It was actually in the garden shed of the family home, which is 19 Humberston Road, shown in the front of that picture. And about 4 years later, he left the Cavendish Labs and started working full-time. Whether the Cavendish Labs knew he had this startup business, we don't know. But it was obviously very successful, and his father joined him, and the company moved several times to different locations. And by 1913, it was employing 40 people, and it was in Hague Road, which is now called Elizabeth Way. This is the sort of equipment they would make. That's an example of a Pye galvanometer used for measuring electric current. And they made a whole range of equipment. They made Wheatstone bridges, resistance boxes, lots of electrical equipment, optical equipment, etc. And they were really thriving. And as I say, had 40 people by the start of the First World War. When the war started, they switched their attention to supporting the war effort, so they made things like gun sights. This is an example of a WG Pye gun sight, which we have at the museum. They also made some of the first oldest signalling lamps, and detonators. After the First World War, though, the military equipment market disappeared, and they were forced into short-term working. They were really scrabbling around looking for new technologies or businesses to get into. Now, about this time, Harold Pye, who was WG's son, who'd just graduated from Cambridge, obviously a young Turk, he said, why don't we get into this new field of wireless? This was about 1922, and the British Broadcasting Company was just beginning its centenary next year. And so they decided they would have a go at making a wireless. And this is a Pye unit system from 1922. On the right is the factory at Hague Road, so you can see what it looked like in those days. And if we just zoom in on that, for those of you that are engineers, you can see that it was actually completely obvious how it works. It is to me, anyway. So on the right-hand side, you've got the tuning coil and the tuning capacitor. You can see where the aerial and earth were connected. And there were a set of valve modules, and these were just made exactly the same way as Pye used to make their scientific instruments, the same wooden boxes, same sort of baker-like tops. And they had the circuit diagrams etched into the top, so that you could see, as we connected it up, how the radio worked. On the left-hand side, so you can imagine on the right-hand side there's an RF amplifier, middle is a detector. On the left-hand side there is an audio output amplifier to an output transformer and to the headphones. There's a low-tension accumulator to drive the heaters and a high-tension or high-voltage battery that drives the rest of it. And you can see here some examples. So on the left-hand side is an example of one of the valve modules. It's actually in the hands of a private collector who's shown it to me. And you can see there the circuit diagram on the top. On the right-hand side is the variable tuning capacitor that we've got at the museum. And it's transparent, so you can see the vanes operating as it works. So you can see it's very much put together as an educational kit for schools and universities. But it was obviously very successful, and soon they started making a range of integrated sets, and the technology started to improve. And we've got a little video that tells you a little bit more about it. I love the way they say that it took a week to work, and it worked. I mean, I don't think you'd tell anybody if it didn't work, would you? So the wireless business started to really grow. And this is an example of the technology by the time it reached 1928, so 6 years later. This is the Pye 25, and it was one of the first portable wireless sets. On the right-hand side, you can see it open to reveal the innards. At the bottom, you would have had an accumulator and a high-tension battery. And it must have been very heavy, although it's described as portable. You can see how the handle on that one is rather distorted. So I can imagine it was, you can move it, but it wasn't how we would think of it as the portable set. Another important thing is on the left-hand side, you can see the speaker fret, and it has this rising sun motif, and that became very much a Pye trademark over the years. Now, a very important guy appears in the picture now. This is C.O. Stanley, Charles Orr Stanley, but he was always known as C.O. In 1923, he founded a company called Arcs Publicity, which was a marketing company, and W.G. Pye was one of his customers, and also Mullard, who made valves. He was a very visionary character, and he could see the potential of wireless way back then, and he started marketing kits for making radio sets at home. But in 1928, Philips, the electronics company from the Netherlands, bought Mullard valve company. And CO thought, I wonder if Pye would be interested in selling the wireless business to Philips. So he went to WG, who then said, no, under no circumstances. But we think he had to think about that, because he was probably an instrument maker at heart. And he came back to CO and said, yeah, I think I could be interested in selling the wireless business. So CEO went to Eindhoven, the headquarters of Philips at that time, and said, I've got a great deal for you, a wireless company, £60,000 and 5,000 for me as commission. And Philips balked at that, as you can imagine. They thought, well, why are we paying him £5,000? So he came rushing back to the UK. He wrote a cheque for £5,000 and went to WG and said, I'll buy the business. Here's a down payment, and I'll get you the rest of the money. He then went to his bank manager at Barclays in London, and he took a Pye Model 25 radio set with him. When he told the bank manager he'd written this cheque for £5,000, he got a lecture because I think he only had about £100 in the bank. But and the bank manager said, well, I'm not really convinced that this wireless business is anything special. But you can see that CEO was a born salesman. He demonstrated the radio to him, took it around the office and showed it what it would do. The manager was totally convinced and lent him the £5,000. So CEO took over the wireless part of WG Pye, and the same year floated it on the stock exchange, got all the money back, paid WG Pye, and he had a controlling interest himself. So he was really quite an entrepreneur. So WG Pye, the instrument business, moved out of Hague Road and moved to Newmarket Road, number 80. Harold Pye became director and WG retired. And they carried on making scientific instruments and being very successful and expanding in the following years. But we'll carry on and just talk about the Pye radio part of the business first. They were extremely successful. They grew the business very dramatically. This is an example of a Pye radio set, again using the Rising Sun fret loudspeaker fret, called the Twin Triple. And they were making 40,000 radios a year in the 1930s. And they had to expand the factory. You'll constantly see how CEO was very visionary. He must have been Steve Jobs of his time, really. He very quickly thought, look, television is the next thing. And he recruited this chap, Peter Goldmark, who was a 27-year-old Hungarian. One of the things we noticed with CEO is he really liked sort of maverick, off-the-wall inventors. And in fact, Peter Goldmark's autobiography is called Maverick Engineer, and you read it, you can tell he was completely uncontrollable, I would say. Anyway, Peter had actually applied to work with Logie Baird, but had been turned down, and then came to Pye. He started working on 30-line mechanical television, very quickly decided that wasn't the future, and switched to electrical television. And there's a lovely quote, the Duke of Kent came to visit Pye and saw television demonstrated by Peter Goldmark and said, no, this is never going to be successful. It's never going to replace cricket, you know. This is now the depression, really. Pye decided it was costing a lot of money. They thought maybe television was going to be a longer-term thing. So Peter Goldman was made redundant. He went to the US, maintained contact with Pye for many, many years. And he went to CBS, and he's extremely well known. He invented the LP record. He invented sequential color television. He was a very innovative character, but continued contact with Pye. They decided they better restart television development 4 years later, or 2 years later after Peter left. And so CEO recruited these two characters. Barden J. Edwards, described as eccentric and foul-mouthed. They were from STC. And Donald Jackson, who got the nickname Mad Jackson, because he was always running around very fast. He actually took all of the internal doors off of his house, much to his wife's chagrin, in order to move around the house more quickly. And they furiously set about developing television. And at the same time as they were working on television, CEO started the first Pye component company, Cathodian. I think he probably could see that they didn't want to be dependent upon a competitor like Philips with Mallard valves. So Cathodian was set up in Church Street, Chesterton, making valves and cathode ray tubes. And this is an example here of a what's called a signal generator tube. It's a type of tube that would have been used to produce test card patterns, for example. Pye were already with television sets for when the BBC launched the first TV service in 1936. And the television here on the left is actually a combined television and radiogram. And they had that set and a normal television only. And back in 1936, the combined radio gramophone television was 135 guineas, which I worked out as being £10,000 in today's. So only the province of the very rich. And apparently the programs were terrible. They had a test program for this trade in the morning for an hour. They had an hour in the afternoon, an hour in the evening, nothing on Sunday evenings. Quickly that improved. CO was one of these people who must have been a thorn in the side of the government. He was constantly berating the government for not doing things. He had a go at the government for not having more programs and so forth. But very quickly they had to reduce the cost of televisions, and this is an example of a 5-inch television. It uses a special cathodian tube. Has no sound. You actually plugged it into the back of your radio set using the gramophone pickup sockets to save money. And it had a very low EHT to drive the CRT, only 900 volts, so it was a lot of things to reduce cost. This is Alexander Palace, transmitter in London, and this is where the only place where you could get television from. You couldn't receive it in Cambridge, it was only received around about the London area. So clearly Pye wanted to be able to sell more television sets and sell them into other places. In 1938, Philips Research Labs in Eindhoven presented work they'd been doing on a special valve for televisions called the EE50. Not EF, as it says there, we'll come on to that. The EE50 was very sensitive, and it looked as though this would be just the job for extending the range of television. And clearly, Pye wanted to be able to sell televisions in Cambridge. So they needed to contact Philips, which meant they had to go through Mallard in the UK, and then routed them to Philips. And they worked with Philips to improve the valve until it became the EF50 valve. So various changes were made to it, including this red metal cap, which became known as the Jackson cap. It was obviously Donald Jackson's idea. This valve is called the valve that won the war. It became extremely important for the Second World War. Now, Pye were working on their latest and greatest television in 1939. This is the 915, and it used these EF50 valves, and they needed to be 5 times as sensitive as the competitors, which they managed to do. And they did this by using a special receiver. There was only one channel. They didn't need to have a tuner, so they used what was called a TRF, a tuned radio frequency receiver. So no tuner on it, quite open, but they could make it very sensitive and reduce the cost. And by that means, they could actually receive television at a far greater range than the competitors. Now, clearly, 1939, the war is coming, and the various universities, including Cambridge, were working on radar together with government establishments, and they really needed a very sensitive receiver for use in VHF radar receivers for the IF, the intermediate frequency. And Professor Appleton at Cambridge said to the government, you really ought to go and look at what Pye are doing. They're actually very advanced with their television receivers. So they went to see the television work at Pye, and the receiver for that television set, the 915, was exactly what they needed for radar. So they immediately placed production orders for these, and this became known as the Pye strip. And it was used in a great many radar receivers for the whole war. So as you heard, Pye got really diverted all its effort onto wartime activities at the start of the war. So the entire radio department was switched over to military radio, and the television department switched over to radar. So these are some of the Pye military radio sets. It was just alluded to in that film, but the top left-hand picture is wireless set 18. And this was for infantry. And the government came out with an invitation to tender for infantry radio. Pye looked at it, and we think it was C.O. Stanley who was looking at it, and said, this is not fit for purpose, we're not going to bid for this. And so they actually worked on their own version for 6 weeks, and then came back to the government and said, this is what you should have specified, a much lighter, better performance radio. And in fact, the government switched to placing contracts for their design. And then Pye went on to make other radio sets, like radios in tanks, aircraft, and so forth. Bottom right-hand corner, you might recognise that is a walkie-talkie. Although that's often credited with the Americans as having invented that, there was a commission set up by the government called the Tizzard Commission, which exchanged technology between the UK and the US. And the proximity fuse that was mentioned in the video was one of those things that was transferred. And we think that the walkie-talkie was as well, but we can't prove that. This is a view of that proximity fuse. And the valves in it were made by Cathodian. They were very extra small, very, very rugged valves. Now, the government started to get very worried about these electronics companies being susceptible to bombing, and they thought that Cambridge would be bombed. And a lot of electronic companies were moved to Wales and other places like the Lake District, places where they were well away from potential bombing. But C.O. Stanley refused to move Pye. He's reputed to have said it's Pye of Cambridge, not Pye of Swansea. But he came up with an ingenious scheme. He set up the Pye Village Industry Scheme. And this is whereby lots of people working all around East Anglia, right up to Kings Lynn, Swaffham, down to Sawston and other places, were used to assemble Pye products. And this photograph is Sawston Bakery, when they were building radio sets by the look of it. And that way the whole company was relatively immune to being bombed. And we've spoken to some people who have worked during the wartime, and they also remember taking the equipment home with them. So if wherever they were working would have been bombed, it would have been safe with them. And so during the war, he got up to having 14,000 people all around East Anglia building all these bits of equipment. Near the end of the war, we started to see signs that I think CO could see potential future markets. And he set up Pye Telecoms in 1944 because he could envisage a civil telecommunications business and the huge opportunities that it would come. So it was already set up before the end of the war. By the end of the war, Pye was in a super position. I spoke to one of the, sadly he's now gone, Richard King, but one of the directors of Pye who remembers back to the early 50s. And he said, I think Pye had a good war. Basically, they used to be an expression you used to use in those days. They learned a tremendous amount. They were in a tremendously good position to be able to capitalize on that once the war finished. And so in the 1940s, 50s to early 60s, there was an explosive growth. They got into all sorts of new businesses, television studios, transmitters, scientific instruments. the telecom business and so forth. And I'll talk a bit about those now. There were also, they built a whole lot of new factories. So on the left-hand side of that picture, that's St Andrews Road. That was expanded significantly from where it had been back in the Hague Road days. In 1948, they built a large factory in Larne in Northern Ireland. In 1952, they built a big television factory in Lowestoft. And there were many others that were built, including other places in the world. I've told the story of Pye now sort of chronologically, but it's now reaching a stage where it starts to go off into all sorts of different directions. So this is the sort of structure. This isn't the official structure of the company, but it makes it easier for me to explain it. So consumer products, radio and television, etc., the scientific instruments, radio communications, broadcasting, components, services, and overseas businesses. And that's an example of the New Zealand factory. I'll just talk about the first four of those, though. So in 1946, the BBC started to transmit television again, and we think that CO had been getting his people to work on television before the war finished. The competitors all had pre-war designs that they started to sell, but Pye had a brand new design. So this set the B16 or the D16. They're basically the same chassis, but one was a tabletop and one was a console television. So they were immediately available to sell, and they'd also learned a tremendous amount from their wartime experience about design for manufacture and serviceability and so forth. This is a picture of an article from Wireless World at the time showing the chassis, saying what a credit it is to the designers. But it actually had a huge drawback. So on the left-hand side of that chassis is a large transformer. That's a mains transformer. And it's used to power the set, including powering the EHT for the CRT, which is going to be, I think, about 10,000 volts. And absolutely lethal. For those of you that are engineers will know that's a low impedance source, high voltage, and if you touch that, you're instantly electrocuted. And I spoke to an old chap who do remember one of his colleagues reaching down to try and touch the screening can on a valve at the back of that chassis. And he accidentally touched that and was killed instantly. It became known as the Widowmaker. It also, the magnetic field from the transformer tended to interfere with the picture, so you had that metal screen between the transformer and the tube to try and overcome that. A couple of years later, though, they launched the mains Transformerless television. This was designed by this chap, Ladislav Laks, another one of these eccentric engineers. He was originally a Czechoslovakian, Jewish. He'd escaped from the Nazis during the war, came to the UK, and Theo Stanley discovered him working in the stores and found he was had an academic background and put him straight into the research labs. And Ladislav Laks remembered that the Germans were working on a new way of generating high voltage for the CRTs using a line flyback technique, but they'd never put it in production, and he could only vaguely remembered it. So basically, they reinvented the idea of line flyback EHT for the tube, which is a much safer way of doing this. And this television, the B18 and the D18, used this technique, and every other television company in the world copied Pye. This was the way to do this, much cheaper. It also worked on DC mains. You'll notice the red EF50 valves, they're still using them. They probably had a huge number generated during the war, and they used them for just about everything. Here's the two versions. You can see that tabletop set was 38 guineas plus purchase tax, which I think must be, £1,500 or so now, when you think what a television set costs now. And that was a 9-inch set with one channel. I remember my father had the D18 on the right when I was a kid, and it had a huge magnifying glass on a stand put in front of the 9-inch tube to try and make it bigger. Again, you see Theo Stanley coming into the picture again. He immediately started work on colour television. to the surprise of some of the staff, because this is Pye News, in October 1949, talking about the radio show, and they already had colour television for demonstration. What had happened is that C.O. Stanley had given 10% of Pye's profits to B.J. Edwards and Donald Jackson. Go and develop colour television using Peter Goldmark's principles. So they went off to see Peter Goldmark, CBS, learnt what he was doing, and came back and implemented this back in the UK. Now, what they did was it used a CRT on the receiver, but a mechanical rotating disc, so it was a sequential picture, red, green, and blue. This is a chap, Reg Thompson, who was working on the camera side of this, showing the camera disc. They'd obviously got an actress for the publicity wearing a red dress to demonstrate colour. We spoke to one of the guys who worked on the television receivers, and he said this disc was spinning around very, very fast. And if you picked up the television set and moved it slightly, of course, the disc would rotate slightly, hit the screen and fragment completely, so you didn't dare do that. Very quickly, though, they started working on electronic television. There was work at the University of California on a CRT that could produce colour, and it was very similar to the Sony Trinitron of the 1970s, but it was way back in the 1950s. So the TV receivers were made using this chromatron tube, and the cameras used the mechanical rotation. So they had television studio, colour studio in Cambridge in 1951, and they were refining this so that by 1953, at the time of the Queen's coronation, they had a big demonstration in London of colour television, including to Great Ormond Street Hospital and various other sites in London. A lovely story from one of the technicians who was working on it, who sadly died now, but he remembers his job was to maintain the television sets, making sure they were working. Clearly it was a huge publicity bonanza, and he remembers C.O. Stanley getting very, very drunk, and this chap had to put him to bed. And he said, "I'm putting the C.O. to bed, I can't believe it." Unfortunately, sequential television wasn't approved of in the US. They wanted it to be, understandably, compatible with monochrome television. And so Peter Goldmark's technology was stymied at that point, much to his chagrin. And that basically stopped. But when you think that Pye was demonstrating colour television in 1953, and it wasn't actually launched in this country until 1967, they were a long way ahead of anybody else. Pye started to get into Pye records. They bought a company called Nixar, who made records, and then took them over and made that into Pye records. And here are some of the best-known artists. Sadly, I recognise all of those. It shows my great age. And that was very, very successful. And I think they were strongly promoting LP records. Again, the connection with Peter Goldmark, they were making record players, a famous record player called the Pye Black Box, was actually made under license from CBS. Then, sometime in the early 50s, C.O. Stanley went to the USA and saw transistors. And he came back to the Pye Research Labs and said, "Make transistors." I spoke to one of the chaps who was there at that time, and he said, you couldn't believe what an incredible brief that was. The CEO comes and just says, "Get into this new technology." He said, there was no money, of course, but you had carte blanche to get on and do it. So they started working on germanium transistors. And by 1956, the design team, led again by Ladislav Laks, who was working on the transistor radio, Pye launched the first British transistor radio. They had a subsidiary brand called PAM, and we think they were a bit worried that maybe transistors weren't reliable. So they didn't want to put the Pye name on it straight away in case it didn't work out. It was very successful, as it happens, and within 6 months, there were Pye versions of that PAM radio. And New Market Transistors went on to become a successful company in its own right, making the germanium transistors. They never made silicon, but they made germanium transistors and then went into hybrids and were very successful for many years. Now, remember we talked earlier about how WG Pye had moved out and had gone to Newmarket Road. Well, they'd continued to be successful, and they were still making electronic equipment. Sadly, scale amp galvanometers on the left, I remember using at school. Shows my great age. And they made chromatographs as well. And so Pye bought them back. Harold Pye apparently had been in discussion with CO before the war about being reacquired. CO had an interest in making scientific instruments, but the war had put paid to that. But he bought it 1946, 1947 time. And Harold Pye then retired, and WG Pye became under the full Pye wing. There was also another company, a small scientific instrument company called Unicam, which was short for University of Cambridge. And that had been founded by the Stubbins brothers. We can't find out a lot about them, but this is a picture we've got of Mr. John Stubbins. And they made spectrophotometers. So they were complementary entirely to WG Pye. So the two companies together made quite a powerful scientific instrument company. And in 1968, they were put together at Pye Unicam in a new scientific instrument company in York Street, Cambridge, which is where I worked at one point. And they became a very successful scientific instrument company. They basically got rid of the galvanometers and the electronic equipment. They really focused on analytical equipment like infrared, UV visible, atomic absorption spectrophotometers, and gas and liquid chromatographs, but primarily gas. Pye Telecom, who we mentioned earlier, had been formed in 1944. Basically, they could see a huge opportunity after the war for radio telephone equipment. And they were set up at Ditton Works on Newmarket Road. And there's a lovely little video here which I'm going to show you. You can see even then Pye thinking about the mobile phone that we're all well used to. So we need some sound for this one. Right, you see their vision of the future. Pye Telecom actually went on to become the biggest part of Pye. It was the most profitable business, made 30% of the profits at its peak into mobile communications, portable radios, and back-end systems, so systems for police and emergency services and so forth. Very successful company. Now, in order to sell more television sets, we needed more television stations around the world, and C.O. Stanley, interestingly, was a big investor in ATV, because he wanted to see more independent television. So Pye TV Transmission, TVT, was set up also in 1946. And they went on to make cameras, transmitters, studio equipment. They could provide complete turnkey systems to all around the world. And these are some examples of the things they made and where they were located. They also were pioneers in the mobile outside broadcast systems. So they made those for the BBC and all sorts of companies all around the world. Bottom right, they were also making specialized television cameras. This is an underwater camera that was actually used to find the comet that crashed, and they needed to find out why it had failed, and it was a Pye camera that found that. Then there was a huge number of component and process companies. They were known as the B companies, much to the chagrin of the people who worked for them, but the big companies, Telecom, Unicam, and the TV business were called the A companies. The B companies made all of the components, etc. Became very successful. Labcare, Cathodian, interestingly, Banham's Boatyard, which I can tell you about later if we've got time. Pye Engineering, Newmarket Transistors I mentioned, Cathodian crystals, you can see in the picture on the right-hand side there. Pye Ether making connectors. They also bought a company called LG Hawkins in London who made kettles, toasters, hairdryers, and the well-known Hostess trolley that you probably remember. In 1960, Pye merged initially with Echo. Now, Echo was a similar company to Pye, but about a third the size. It was based in Southend, also early in radio and television, and had also worked on radar during the Second World War. And so there's quite a lot of synergy between the two. But the merger very quickly became a takeover because it was discovered that Echo was not in a good financial state. But we're now talking about Pye at its zenith, which is about the early 1960s. So 30,000 employees worldwide, over 60 companies, 20 in overseas companies, manufacturing in Hong Kong. There's a lot of good things going for it. However, there were problems. When they bought Echo, they realized that there was a diverse range of products. They made toilet seats, for example. They made a huge lot of plastic components. And the market for colour television had just not taken off as they thought it was going to. It didn't happen until '67. And there was a huge amount of stock at Echo. Also, you might remember that back in the 60s, people tended to rent their televisions. They were always worried that the CRT would fail. So companies, the biggest company in the UK was Thorn, British Radio Corporation, and they owned radio rentals, and they were very successful. Pye didn't have such a business. They were very loyal to their independent dealers. So CO was doing deals with these companies whereby they could have a Pye television set, rent it immediately out, but didn't need to pay for it for 2 years. Well, that was not a great financial process. And so by that point, Pye was beginning to get into trouble. They did some questionable deals with a couple of rental companies, one called the Gibbard Group. And of course, the successful companies like Telecom and Unicam, etc., were also being starved of investment at this time because CO was putting the money into the television business. By 1966, the financials were becoming very apparent, and the rest of the directors, staged a revolution. CO was forced to resign. His son, John Stanley, had been appointed previously by CO as the managing director. He was not a chip off the old block. He was not the right character at all. And this is the poll card for the AGM in 1966, getting shareholders to vote for John Stanley to be dismissed. So we get to the point where we talk about the Philips takeover. So November '66, the finances were revealed at the AGM, and Philips immediately made a bid for the entire Pye group. Then a bidding war started. Thorn also wanted Pye, and they made a counter bid. In '67, Philips revealed they'd been buying a lot of Pye shares secretly anyway, so they had quite a lot of them, and they made an increased offer. And by February, the board recommended acceptance of the Philips offer. In actual fact, the government were concerned about a foreign company taking over Pye at that stage, so it wasn't allowed to take over Pye in total until the late 70s. So that takes us through to the Philips takeover. I'm going to canter through this very, very quickly, but basically, what then happened is that there were 3 stages as Pye took over the different businesses. First of all, having acquired it, I think they got a lot of businesses which didn't have any synergy with Philips, and they were let to run by themselves effectively. And they started to focus on integrating some of them into the business and then divesting them. I'm not sure, but I think that the reason Philips really wanted Pye was for the radio and television business. And so they got things like Unicam and a lot of the B companies, etc., which didn't quite fit. So in the standalone phase, the Pye name continued, and so the television business, for example, carried on making televisions in Lowestoft. They still had all the marketing, etc., in Pye. And then during the integration phase, this example of Unicam, they started sort of dual brand. So they always talked about Pye Unicam, but the brochures started to say Philips. And in some cases, complete rebranding to like Pye Telecom went from being Pye, in some cases, to Philips. And then if we go into a couple of examples of what had happened, on the consumer side, 1977, so remember 66, 67, Philips had taken over. So for 10 years or so, it carried on, but then they moved the sales and marketing activity from Cambridge to Philips in Croydon, closed the television production in Lowestoft and moved that to Croydon, and sold the site to Sanyo, who actually continued making television sets until 2009. Pye Telecom actually was merged into Philips radio business and became known as PRCS, and was actually very successful. In fact, the headquarters of PRCS was Cambridge. But by 1996, it was sold to a private equity group and renamed Sumoco, and then later on it was broken up. And there are two businesses that survived, Sepura in Cambridge and Team Telecom. And on the divestment side, the Pye B companies were all gathered together into a business called Cambridge Electronic Industries. I think Philips just didn't want all this collection of businesses around Cambridge, so they formed this in 1980, and it's floated on the stock market. Lovely quote from the Financial Times, though. CEI, great opportunity to obtain shares in Silicon Fen or Philips spitting out the pips. Unicam, which I remember as I worked there, was sold to ATI, a US company, and they retained the Unicam name for some years, and then they were in turn acquired by Thermo Electron, which is now called Thermo Fisher. Thermo Fisher is about the largest analytical instrument company in the world, and they finally closed the Cambridge site in 2014 and moved the activity to Germany and China. I think manufacture had been in China for some while. So these are some of the older Pye sites around, just to show you what they were like. The St Andrews Road site was very big in the 60s. That's the old Pye radio building, and the TV factory at Lowestoft employed about 3,000 people at one point. But as they've all basically gone now, in York Street, that is now housing. It's called St Matthew's Gardens. Pye Telecom, it's basically housing. But Pye still does live on. We've created an exhibition at the Cambridge Technology Museum, which I hope you'll come and visit. We've tried to show the whole history that I've told you. The Pye Foundation, which was originally founded by C.O. Stanley, is a charitable trust which funds various charities in the Cambridge area. It continues to do that and is thriving. The Pye History Trust supports the history of Pye and the website. And the legacy really lives on because lots of Cambridge technology companies today really came out of the Pye of those days. So that's the Pye story.
Bob, thank you. That was wonderful. We were spellbound. I mean, incredible creativity and an incredible ability to move into new products, new technologies, new markets.
Yes. We can't really tell you the whole story, but we've found amazing things like heart pacemakers they were working on in the very early stages. They had a free rein in the research labs, did some very interesting stuff.
So where did all the people come from? I mean, there wasn't, that's the strong link with the university that we now talk about wasn't...
I don't think there was a strong link with the university. No.
Yes.
I think they just, came from everywhere, really.
Yes.
He was very good at recruiting these very strange people, I think, and accommodating. They didn't necessarily, they fitted with what he wanted.
Well, there are quite a few of those around today, aren't there?
Yeah.
Yes. Can I throw this open to questions? I mean, maybe I'll start with Right, let me read a question from our virtual audience. This is John Scott. When Pye started in television, did they originate the technology, or did they start by borrowing existing technology?
No, I think they borrowed existing. They basically started using Logie Baird's mechanical television. But I can't find that they've actually invented that part of it. But they were very, very fast at producing it.
It's a sort of fine line between being first and
Yes.
actually being second, but doing pretty good things too,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. Just looking for, yes, question. I think we're over.
Hello, my name's Dick Payton. I used to work for many years at Cambridge Scientific Instrument Company, and I've just done a history of that company for a lecture tour. But the background to it is that when William Pye, back in 1895, he let his son, who'd worked for him at Cambridge Instruments, let him set up the business, and then 2 years later he went to join him. He'd been a foreman at Cambridge Instruments. Yes. And so that it was, despite being slightly competitive, they remained on pretty good terms for most of their life. And in fact, even I think in the 1920s and 30s, there was sometimes an exchange of personnel when certain skills were needed at WG. Cambridge Instruments used to supply the people, and they'd toddle off down the road to do something on a lathe or something down there. Yes. And the other thing is that was also relevant was about 1905, I think it was, Cambridge Instruments and WG Pye almost got joined up as another company. Basically, there was an offer, discussions were made, it came to naught at that time. And then the other thing, John Stubbins, he was also a foreman at Cambridge Instruments. Oh, right. And he had a slightly disagreement with management and took half his staff with him and set up Unicam.
Ah, right. Interesting. That's useful. Thank you.
Did Pye have anything to do with making the very good transmitters for the Secret Intelligence Service in World War II?
We think they did. One of the problems with the Second World War material, a lot of it's secret, and we just can't find all the information on it.
Still?
Yeah, we just can't find it, basically. And a lot of the people that we interviewed who were there at the time wouldn't talk about it. They probably would do nowadays, but at that time they didn't. The interesting thing is that Peter Goldman also worked in the UK during the war. He ran the British-American countermeasures lab, but he doesn't even mention any more than that in his book. I think a lot of it was secret, but he must have been working with Pye, I believe, at that time.
You mentioned they made a large range of instruments, scientific instruments, and my colleague and I used to work at the Atomic Energy Research Establishment at Harwell, which now unfortunately I think is defunct. But and we used the gas chromatographs, which you showed actually, in fact, to study the composition of the atmosphere, and found many, many gases, in fact, which were involved in all sorts of interesting forms of air pollution, acid rain, photochemical smog, loss of stratospheric ozone. And these were gas chromatographs equipped with different types of detector, flame ionization, electron capture, flame photometric, which I used actually to show the presence of all sorts of interesting sulfur gases in the atmosphere. And the Pye instruments actually really were rather good, and we fiddled around with them to modify them and make them better in some respects, but really good, solid, sensible, simple instrument. I don't know if Tony's got anything to say, because one of your consultants was a man called James Lovelock, I think.
Yes.
Well, James Lovelock invented the electron capture detector when he was working at the National Institute of Medical Research at Mill Hill, along with a couple of other people who were central to the development of gas chromatographs. And Pye was the UK company that picked up those techniques, which essentially the measurements in the atmosphere, they're all up in Glasgow actually worrying about greenhouse gases, and that work was central to the identification of that bit of science.
It's sort of interesting that the scientific instrument side, which was the origin,
Yes.
has been the bit that has endured. I mean, the examination of what's in the atmosphere, the same kit can be used for multiple purposes, and it's turned out to be a high margin and vast business, the scientific
Yes,
instrument
it is,
side.
yeah.
And Thermo
Yeah.
Fisher is
And I
a
think-
massively valuable company.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Very successful.
Which perhaps one isn't aware of. And then the
Quite low
sort of
profile.
consumer bits, I mean, well, most of us don't sort of know
No.
just how valuable these instrument companies are.
No. So Thermo Fisher is twice the size, 3 times the size of Philips now.
Yeah. There's a question, right, yeah.
My name's Bill Key. I've been involved with rowing over many years. This is relevant. Pye's had a boat club, or rowing club, which was founded about 80 years ago. And now it's called Cheston Rowing Club, which has no connection at all with the original Pye group. But in order to keep the sort of background from their naming their boats, one of their boats is called WG Pye.
Right.
And last summer, I named another of their new boats, Annie Eliza, who was the wife of W.G. Pye.
Yes.
Just a little bit of background. And another little point, I believe just before 625 was introduced, Pye's had an advert, Pye times 625 equals 1967.
Very good. That's a new one.
Recurring, yes. Yeah. Question at the back, yeah.
Can I just comment on the relationship between Pye and the university? Back in, I suspect it was 1967, when I was in the Cavendish, I ended up, for some reason, being Sir Neville Mott's bag carrier. And we went to a number of local companies, one of them being Pye, and we were received by the great and the good there. I won't mention the names at this stage. And essentially, we were spat out. It wasn't a very comfortable meeting. And I remember returning with Mott, of course, to the Cavendish, and he was not despairing, but shall we say, rather disappointed. I have to say that then after this, some 4 years later, I went to join the Pye group, and I spent 17 years working for them. So that was my background to it, though.
Because I mean, that's when the UK was missing the semiconductor solid-state electronics boat nationally, that we weren't making those investments.
We weren't received very well.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's quite astonishing to see a startup back in more than 100 years ago. And I'm wondering, as an, student who wants to do startup in the future, I'm wondering whether there is one suggestion you would like to offer to, for the, students who want to do startup based on your more than 100 years history. Thank you very much.
Well, I think it's a great case study, isn't it, basically? But, Winston Churchill, who said the sad lesson of history is that no one learns the lessons of history. So I think the problem is, well, you can see what happened, but I suspect people are doomed to do it again.
Just another gloss, Bob, which is that the shakeout of Pye people was absolutely fundamental in a lot of newly emerging Cambridge companies, because the academics needed really well-trained technical engineers to take their inventions through to market. And I think the labour market impact of those closures is very significant.
Yeah.
Well, that sort of, sort of compost heap of technology, creativity, or whatever,
Yes.
my metaphor isn't going very far.
Yeah.
Is that a positive message to draw the
Well, I think
things to a close,
so.
or-
I think one of the things we tried to do, what we've given up with really, was to try and show a family tree of how Pye evolved into all these other companies. But it just went so big, so wide, we couldn't do it.
But I mean, if we sort of, I think now we should probably I mean, there's been lots of questions. I'm sure we could carry on, but it's, the evening is drawing on. The bar might close. It's a fabulous story. I mean, you brought it to life brilliantly. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
And that sort of sense that, how many thousand jobs? 35,000 jobs distributed around the UK.
There were 30,000 worldwide. There were
Yes.
14,000 in East Anglia.
But Cambridge High Tech is now, I mean, the sort of number of high-tech jobs is past 65,000,
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah,
So it's not just though the
It's so to see.
spirit has died, it's just
Grown.
not in the same companies.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Am I pushing that a little bit far? But I
No,
feel this was...
I think all we wanted to do with
yes.
this was to just
Yeah.
remind people this is how a lot of it started.
So can I ask all of us to thank
Thank you.
Dr.